My toxic mother-in-law tried to secretly evict me from my apartment, not realizing I bought the entire building. The commercial real estate world taught me early in my career that true authority doesn't scream. It whispers through corporate deeds, non-disclosure agreements, and anonymous holding companies. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, however, operated on a completely different philosophy. She believed power was defined by loud criticisms, passive-aggressive remarks at the dinner table, and an unyielding desire to control every aspect of her son Liam's life. For 3 years, she systematically belittled my career, assuming I was a low-level cubicle worker because I drove a modest car and refused to flaunt my earnings. Her obsession reached a boiling point when she attempted to force us out of our luxury downtown loft by manipulating the property manager into serving us an immediate eviction notice. What Beatrice fundamentally failed to realize, however, was that my private acquisition firm had quietly purchased the entire residential building 6 months ago. I have always preferred to operate beneath the radar. As a senior director of commercial acquisitions for a private equity firm, I routinely orchestrate multi-million-dollar property portfolios across the metro area. It is a high-stakes, exceptionally lucrative career that requires absolute emotional detachment and an analytical mind. My husband, Liam, a passionate high school history teacher, completely anchors me. He loves his work and I love mine. Because I prefer financial stealth, I drive a standard hatchback, dress in understated professional attire, and keep our financial achievements completely private. Liam knows I am highly successful, but he has never cared about the specific metrics of my net worth. He loved me for who I was long before the promotions arrived. His mother, Beatrice, measured human worth exclusively through superficial displays of luxury. She lived in a sprawling multi-million-dollar suburban estate and treated anyone outside her affluent social circle with absolute disdain. From the moment Liam introduced us, Beatrice made it her personal mission to show me I was an unacceptable match for her son. She frequently dropped passive-aggressive comments about my uninspired office job and openly lamented that Liam hadn't married a woman from a prominent country club family. She assumed that because we weren't buying a massive suburban mansion next to hers, we were financially struggling. The true epicenter of her frustration was our home. Liam and I lived in a breathtaking 2-story penthouse loft inside a beautifully restored historic brick complex downtown called the Foundry Lofts. It featured massive industrial windows, original exposed timber beams, and a private rooftop terrace overlooking the river. It was our sanctuary. Beatrice absolutely despised it. She viewed the downtown district as chaotic, dangerous, and beneath her family's social standing. More importantly, our urban lifestyle meant she couldn't easily drop by unannounced to micromanage our lives. To rectify this, Beatrice had spent a small fortune completely renovating the walkout basement of her suburban estate into a fully self-contained apartment. For over a year, she subjected Liam to an endless barrage of guilt trips, manipulation tactics, and manufactured health scares, aggressively pressuring us to give up our loft and move into her lower level. She framed it as a generous, cost-saving measure for a struggling young couple, but the underlying motive was blindingly obvious. She wanted total, unmonitored control over our daily schedule, our future children, and our marriage. When I flatly and politely refused to surrender our independence to live in her basement, Beatrice decided to bypass my consent entirely. What Beatrice did not realize was that the original development group behind the Foundry Lofts had encountered severe liquidity issues 6 months prior, quietly placing the entire historic complex on the commercial market. Recognizing the immense long-term appreciation value of the asset, I utilized my private capital holding company, an anonymous entity registered as Aegis Holdings LLC, to buy the entire building out of foreclosure. I kept the transaction entirely separate from our personal life, hiding behind the corporate entity to avoid family complications. To the building's on-site staff, I was simply the quiet tenant occupying Penthouse 4B. To the executive board of the property management company, I was the sole proprietor who owned their entire multi-year employment contract. Beatrice's covert operations began to materialize early last month. Through casual gossip at her golf club, she discovered that our building's resident property manager, a slippery, easily influenced man named Mr. Davenport, was the nephew of her close friend. Sensing an immediate point of leverage, Beatrice began feeding Mr. Davenport a series of completely fabricated complaints. Over a 3-week period, she utilized various aliases and anonymous email accounts to lodge formal grievances against Penthouse 4B. She claimed I was running an illegal, high-traffic commercial consulting business out of the residential unit, hosting disruptive, late-night corporate parties, and violating the structural weight limitations on the private terrace. Mr. Davenport, eager to curry favor with a wealthy suburban elite and completely oblivious to the legal realities of his position, bypassed every single standard internal investigation protocol. He didn't review the building's internal security footage, nor did he speak to our immediate neighbors on the 4th floor. He simply allowed Beatrice to dictate a fraudulent paper trail against us. The trap was officially sprung on a Friday morning. I was sitting at our kitchen island reviewing an acquisition brief when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the front door. I opened it to find a courier holding a formal certified document. It was an immediate lease termination and unconditional eviction notice, bearing Mr. Davenport's official signature. The document cited gross, repeated violations of the community guidelines, giving us exactly 14 days to completely vacate the premises or face formal unlawful detainer proceedings in housing court. Liam panicked the moment his eyes scanned the paperwork. He began pacing the hardwood floor, his face completely pale, frantically trying to comprehend how a series of entirely baseless complaints could result in an immediate eviction without a single prior warning. Right as his anxiety hit its absolute peak, his phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID displayed Beatrice's name. She was calling to invite us to an urgent, mandatory Sunday brunch at her estate, claiming she had just heard through the grapevine that our building was experiencing management instability, and that she had a wonderful, protective solution to our sudden housing crisis. I looked down at the eviction notice, tracking the specific internal filing numbers, and a cold, entirely calm smile settled over my face. The pieces of her clumsy operation had just fallen perfectly into place. I looked up at my panicking husband, told him to take a deep breath, pack his best Sunday suit, and let his mother host us. The drive to Beatrice's estate on Sunday morning was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Liam sat in the passenger seat of my hatchback, his fingers nervously tracing the crisp edge of the certified eviction notice he had refused to leave behind. He stared blankly out the window as we pulled through the massive, ornate iron gates of his mother's 3-acre property. To him, those gates represented a golden cage he had spent his entire adult life trying to escape. To me, they were just an overvalued piece of residential architecture with a bloated property tax assessment. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and looked at my husband. I squeezed his hand, gently reminding him that a piece of paper only holds power if you respect the person who signed it. He nodded, trying his best to mirror my composure, but the anxiety rolling off his shoulders was completely palpable. Beatrice was already waiting for us on the rear terrace, a perfectly manicured stone patio flanked by towering marble pillars and rows of imported white rose bushes. The brunch spread she had ordered was obscenely lavish. Crystal carafes of freshly squeezed mimosas, sterling silver trays of artisanal pastries, and a private catering chef standing quietly in the background to attend to her every whim. It was classic Beatrice. Every single family gathering was transformed into a highly theatrical display of her immense financial superiority. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored white designer suit, looking less like a mother welcoming her son and more like a high court judge preparing to pass a final sentence on an inferior citizen. As we took our seats at the marble table, she didn't even bother to look in my direction. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Liam, her expression a masterclass in performative maternal heartbreak. Before the first course was even served, Beatrice leaned forward, her heavy diamond rings catching the morning sunlight as she picked up her crystal flute. "Liam, my sweet boy, you look absolutely exhausted," she sighed, her voice dripping with a carefully rehearsed artificial sympathy. But honestly, I cannot say I am surprised. I received a rather disturbing call from my close friend's nephew, Mr. Davenport, over at your residential complex. He informed me about the devastating news regarding your immediate eviction notice. Liam's jaw clenched tightly, his knuckles turning completely white against his cloth napkin. He opened his mouth to defend us, to explain that the complaints were a series of completely fabricated lies. But Beatrice casually raised her manicured hand, cutting him off with a sharp, dismissive wave. "There is no need to make excuses, Liam," she continued smoothly, her gaze finally snapping to me with a cold, venomous triumph. "A premium downtown building simply cannot tolerate that kind of operational liability. Hosting unauthorized corporate events, running illegal, high-traffic consulting businesses out of a residential unit, it's simply not the lifestyle for a respectable family. The management company was entirely within their rights to protect their asset from Paige's uninspired professional choices." She reached into her leather designer handbag, pulled out a thick bound legal folder, and slid it aggressively across the marble table, letting it land right between our plates. It was a pre-drafted, multi-year lease agreement for her newly renovated walkout basement apartment. "You simply do not have the financial leverage or the legal resources to combat a major property corporation in housing court, Liam," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute authority. "Fortunately for you, I have already used my personal country club connections to speak directly with the management network. I've agreed to ensure this eviction doesn't completely ruin your credit profile, provided you sign this lease today, and move your belongings into my lower level by next weekend. It is time to let go of this ridiculous downtown fantasy page and bring my son back home where he belongs. I let her words hang in the warm morning air for a long, agonizing moment. I didn't flinch, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't reach for the glass of champagne she had poured. Instead, I slowly picked up the basement lease agreement, spinning it casually between my fingers before dropping it back onto the table, like a piece of worthless scrap paper. You are entirely correct about one thing, Beatrice, I said, leaning back in my chair and locking my eyes onto hers. Property corporations hold an immense amount of structural leverage, and it is a catastrophic mistake for an outside amateur to try and cross them. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out my corporate tablet, and unlocked a secure, cryptographically verified registry portal. I turned the screen around, sliding it directly over her pre-drafted lease. The confusion on Beatrice's face was instantaneous. Her eyes darted across the official corporate layout of Aegis Holdings LLC, tracking the digital asset deeds, the capitalization tables, and the corporate entity filings until her gaze landed on the final, unassailable line, my name, listed as the sole managing director, primary stakeholder, and 100% equity owner of the Foundry Lofts. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening slightly as her brain desperately tried to find a structural flaw in the document. What? What nonsense is this? She stammered, the vibrant color beginning to drain from her cheeks. You're an office worker. You don't own a historic landmark. Before she could recover her composure, I placed my phone directly on the center of the table and dialed the regional director of the property management firm on speakerphone. He answered on the very first ring, his voice dripping with an immediate, profound professional deference that completely shattered Beatrice's remaining confidence. Good morning. Director Thorne, I said, my voice entirely calm and clinical. I am currently reviewing an unauthorized lease termination issued to Penthouse 4B by your on-site manager, Mr. Davenport. Ma'am, please accept our immediate and deepest apologies. Director Thorne responded, his voice echoing clearly across the silent terrace. We flagged that filing in our internal system just 2 hours ago. It completely bypassed our corporate review protocols. Mr. Davenport accepted completely unverified, fraudulent complaints from an outside party due to a personal country club connection, I stated flatly. He has severely violated our corporate compliance policies, breached strict tenant privacy laws, and exposed our holding company to massive civil liabilities. Understood perfectly. Ma'am, Director Thorne replied without a single second of hesitation. Mr. Davenport's employment with our firm is terminated effective immediately. We are dispatching a regional supervisor to lock him out of the leasing office by noon today. Excellent, I said, looking directly at Beatrice as her hands began to visibly shake. Furthermore, I want a permanent, lifetime criminal trespass warning issued against Beatrice Vance. She is to be legally banned from entering any residential structure, parking facility, or commercial footprint owned by Aegis Holdings LLC. If she touches the property, have security contact local law enforcement immediately. It will be executed by our legal team within the hour. Ma'am, Director Thorne confirmed before disconnecting the line. The silence that followed was absolute. The grand matriarch, who had spent years treating me like an expendable cubicle worker, sat in stunned, breathless silence. Her hands shook so violently she accidentally knocked her crystal glass over, sending a pool of sticky mimosa splashing across her pristine white designer suit. She had just stripped her own inside contact of his career, exposed herself to a massive harassment lawsuit, and permanently banned herself from ever stepping foot into her son's home. Liam sat next to me, staring at his mother's pale face, a slow, incredibly proud smile breaking across his features. I reclaimed my tablet, stood up from the table, and looked down at her. You can keep your basement lease, Beatrice, I said quietly. Our penthouse view is far superior, and the security downstairs has just been upgraded to keep parasites entirely out of the building. We walked away from the estate, leaving the lavish brunch completely untouched. For the next 5 days, our life was entirely peaceful. Mr. Davenport was cleared out of the building. The fraudulent eviction was completely expunged from our records, and Beatrice's frantic phone calls to Liam were met with total, unyielding radio silence. We spent our evenings on our rooftop terrace, drinking wine and mapping out the final details of our upcoming wedding. But a woman like Beatrice doesn't accept public humiliation quietly. Her entire identity was built on dominance, and her failure to control us had driven her into a state of manic desperation. Yesterday morning, the true retaliation arrived. I was in the middle of a high-value corporate acquisition meeting at my firm when my personal assistant interrupted, looking visibly rattled. She handed me a formal, certified legal summons delivered by a high-priority courier. Beatrice hadn't just hired a standard family attorney. She had utilized her elite high-society connections to launch a scorched earth campaign against my career. She had filed a massive, fraudulent corporate ethics complaint, directly with the Global Compliance Board of my private equity firm, alongside a formal report to the state licensing board. The documents accused me of insider trading, predatory corporate acquisition tactics, and leveraging confidential tenant data to extort local business owners. The complaint alleged that I had illegally used my firm's capital to buy the Foundry Lofts specifically to execute a personal vendetta against her family, threatening to trigger a massive federal regulatory audit that could completely dissolve my career and destroy my firm's reputation if I didn't immediately sign the building's deeds over to her name. The threat of a federal regulatory audit would have sent any standard corporate executive into a blinding panic. But Beatrice fundamentally misunderstood the precise nature of my profession. In the ruthless arena of high-stakes commercial real estate, you do not survive for a single day without maintaining an absolute, unassailable paper trail. When Liam saw the compliance summons resting on our kitchen island, he looked like he might physically collapse from the stress. His voice shook as he read the allegations aloud, horrified that his mother was willing to burn down my entire career just to force us under her control. I simply sat down, opened the legal packet, and began to analyze the documents with a cold, clinical focus. That was when I discovered the fatal error Beatrice's high-priced attorney had made. Attached to the very back of the legal threat was a formal confidential settlement release. It explicitly stated that the ethics complaint and the demand for a federal audit would be quietly and permanently withdrawn the moment I legally signed over the title deeds of the Foundry Lofts to Beatrice's private family trust. In her manic desperation to humble me, she had put a textbook felony extortion demand in writing. I didn't spend the weekend crying or panicking. Instead, I spent 48 hours compiling a flawless digital defense packet. On Monday morning, I walked into the executive boardroom at my private equity firm. I didn't arrive as a defensive employee under investigation. I arrived as a senior director presenting an ironclad case of an outside bad actor attempting to extort our corporate holdings. I sat across from Director Henderson, our chief compliance officer, and the firm's global legal board. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense as I plugged my tablet into the central projector, filling the wall-mounted screens with the encrypted financial layout of Aegis Holdings LLC. I walked the legal team through the data chronologically. I showed them the verified banking logs proving that the purchase of the Foundry Lofts utilized 100% of my independent private capital, entirely separated from our firm's investment funds. I demonstrated that the acquisition was finalized 6 months prior, long before Beatrice ever initiated her fraudulent eviction scheme with Mr. Davenport. Finally, I projected the written settlement offer her attorney had drafted, highlighting the exact sentences demanding the transfer of a multi-million-dollar real estate asset under the threat of regulatory sabotage. The shift in the boardroom was instantaneous. Director Henderson's corporate caution vanished, replaced by absolute professional indignation. Our firm's global legal counsel wasn't just dismissive of Beatrice's fraudulent ethics complaint. They were deeply insulted that an outside suburban socialite had attempted to weaponize our internal compliance department to settle a petty family vendetta. The corporation immediately stepped in to protect its senior director, realizing that allowing an outside actor to extort one of their top acquisition leads was an unacceptable threat to the firm's market reputation. By the time the meeting adjourned, our corporate litigation team had drafted a devastating countersuit against Beatrice individually for tortious interference, commercial defamation, and malicious prosecution, seeking $10 million in punitive damages. Simultaneously, our chief counsel forwarded the written blackmail letter and the encrypted server logs directly to the state attorney general and the local district attorney's office. The fallout for Beatrice was instantaneous, public, and utterly catastrophic. Extortion is a severe criminal offense, and the district attorney did not care about her high society status or her country club connections. A week after our boardroom meeting, 2 plainclothes detectives arrived at Beatrice's sprawling suburban estate, serving a formal criminal indictment and an asset-freezing order related to the ongoing corporate extortion investigation. The local business journals and neighborhood news outlets picked up the story immediately, running front-page articles about a prominent local matriarch facing felony blackmail charges and corporate espionage investigations. Her elite social circle, built entirely on the fragile foundation of superficial prestige, vanished overnight. The very country club families she had spent decades trying to impress immediately blacklisted her. Corporate boards revoked her honorary seats, and her closest friends refused to return her calls to avoid being dragged into a federal-level financial scandal. Within a matter of months, Beatrice was forced to retain a massive team of criminal defense attorneys just to keep herself out of a prison cell, rapidly draining the very suburban wealth she had previously used as a weapon against our marriage. Because of her malicious actions, her private trust was tied up in endless litigation, rendering her unable to even fund the upkeep of the massive estate she loved so dearly. Liam and I officially cut all remaining ties, changing our phone numbers, revoking her family's access to our emergency contacts, and ensuring she was entirely erased from our digital lives. The legal supervisors at the Foundry Lofts enforced the lifetime criminal trespass warning with absolute rigidity, ensuring that she could never even drive down our street without facing immediate arrest. Today, our life in the penthouse is defined by an incredible, uninterrupted peace. We spend our evenings on our private rooftop terrace, watching the city lights reflect off the river, completely secure in the structural permanence of a home that belongs entirely to us. Beatrice spent years believing that her loud manipulation, financial bullying, and family guilt trips could permanently conquer my quiet independence. But she made the ultimate mistake of bringing an emotional vendetta into a corporate arena. And in the world of high-stakes acquisition, the data always wins.